It had been a long time since I noticed the spark between my husband and me slowly flickering out, dimming to something closer to routine companionship. At 50, Dan seemed content with the predictability of his beer in hand, eyes glued to the TV screen week after week. And I had grown used to it, until recently, when I couldn't ignore the small, yet persistent awareness stirring inside me. It started with glances. Not the kind exchanged between couples who'd spent decades together, but rather something hesitant, curious. My son, Ethan, had always been different from his father. Where Dan was laid back to the point of inertia, Ethan was vibrant, full of energy, and always striving toward something. At 18, he had grown into a young man who no longer resembled the little boy I used to chase around the playground. It wasn't just his broad shoulders or his athletic frame. It was the confidence in the way he carried himself, the spark of ambition in his gaze. I didn't know when I first noticed him noticing me. Maybe it was one of those quiet evenings when we sat around the dining table after dinner. The hum of the dishwasher in the background, Dan muttering at a game on TV, and Ethan helping me clear the plates without being asked. He'd brushed past me in the kitchen, his hand grazing mine for just a second too long. I had smiled, thanking him, but something about the way he looked at me made me pause. His eyes held something I wasn't ready to acknowledge, so I pretended not to notice. That pretense, however, became harder to maintain. One evening, as the sunset painted the kitchen in a golden glow, Ethan leaned against the counter while I washed the dishes. He had just returned from basketball practice, his hair damp, clinging to his forehead. His shirt clung to his chest, and I tried not to stare. "Mom, you okay?" His voice pulled me from my thoughts, and I realized I had been scrubbing the same plate for far too long. I laughed nervously, just lost in thought. He nodded but didn't look away. "You've been doing that a lot lately." There was something about the way he said it, soft, as though he knew the exact thoughts I was trying to suppress. I cleared my throat, rinsed the plate, and placed it on the drying rack. "You're imagining things," I replied, hoping to sound casual, but my voice betrayed me. The weight of his gaze lingered as I busied myself wiping down the counter. "I'm not," he murmured. I stopped, gripping the edge of the counter as the room fell silent. Outside, the cicadas chirped their endless song, and for a moment, it was the only sound filling the space between us. I didn't dare turn around, but I felt him move closer. His presence was unmistakable, his warmth radiating just behind me. "Ethan," I whispered, barely able to say his name without my breath catching. "Yes." His voice was low, too low, as though he knew exactly what this moment meant. I finally turned, and he was closer than I realized. Close enough that I could see the bead of sweat trailing down his temple, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. My fingers tightened around the dish towel, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't allow to settle. This was wrong. He was my son. I shouldn't be standing here, breathless, heart pounding, but the unspoken pull between us was undeniable. "Your dad's in the living room," I managed to say, my voice trembling. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "He won't notice." He was right, and we both knew it. Dan hadn't noticed much about me in years. But Ethan had. And now, in this small kitchen illuminated by the fading light of dusk, I was realizing just how much. "I think you should go shower," I said, taking a step back, my voice firmer this time. I needed space to think, to breathe. Ethan studied me for a moment longer, then nodded. "Sure, Mom." As he turned and walked away, I exhaled the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The room felt smaller, warmer, suffocating in the aftermath of whatever that had just been. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the rapid beat of my heart, and tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment, a misunderstanding I could put behind me. But deep down I knew the truth. The line had blurred, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't go back to pretending otherwise. The shower water shut off, and I heard the faint thud of Ethan's footsteps against the wooden floor. I was still in the kitchen, pretending to scrub the same countertop for the 10th time, as though physical tasks could ground my spiraling mind. My heart was still racing, replaying that moment when he stood so close I could feel the heat of his breath on my neck. I needed time. Time to shake off this strange, confusing pull. But time wasn't something I had. Not when I heard his footsteps moving toward the living room. Dan was exactly where he always was. His feet propped up on the coffee table, a half-empty can of beer resting on the arm of his recliner. The glow of the television flickered against his face, casting shadows over the lines that had deepened with time. I peeked out from the doorway, nervous but unable to stay away. Ethan stood by the armrest, watching his father in silence for a moment before speaking. "Dad," he said, voice steady. Dan barely glanced away from the TV. "Tell me," Ethan pressed, stepping closer. "Do you really not see how beautiful and smart Mom is?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air thickened, heavy and still. I gripped the edge of the doorframe, my knuckles whitening. What was he doing? Dan chuckled, the sound casual and dismissive. "What's this about?" He reached for his beer, taking a sip. "Your mom's fine, you know that. She takes care of the house, keeps things running smoothly. She's good." "Good." Ethan's voice sharpened. I could see his jaw clench from where I stood, the muscle ticking with tension. "She's more than that. She's brilliant, beautiful, and you don't even notice her anymore." Dan's brow furrowed, as if the accusation was more of an annoyance than something worth considering. He muted the TV and turned to face Ethan fully. "What's gotten into you, huh? Why are you talking like this?" Ethan shook his head, exhaling sharply. "'Cause I see her. And it's painful to watch you take her for granted like she's just another part of the furniture." Dan leaned back in his chair, clearly baffled. He scratched his head, the weight of the conversation dawning on him slowly. "You don't get it. After 20 years of marriage, things change. It's not about fireworks every day. We're comfortable. That's what happens." "Comfortable," Ethan repeated, his voice rising just enough to make Dan shift uneasily. "You've let her fade into the background of your life. You don't even ask her how her day was anymore. Do you know what she's been thinking? What she wants? When's the last time you noticed how good she looks when she dresses up for dinner? Or how she lights up when she talks about something she's passionate about?" Dan stared at him, silent for once. I could see the flicker of defensiveness in his eyes, but it wasn't as strong as the confusion, like he was realizing that Ethan wasn't just speaking out of nowhere. "Look," Dan said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I know your mom. I love her. It's just that things change when you've been together this long. You'll understand when you're older." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound more of a scoff. "I don't think I want to understand if it means treating someone like they're invisible." My breath hitched. I pressed a hand over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. My emotions were swirling. Gratitude for Ethan's words, embarrassment that he had noticed what even I tried to ignore, and a deep ache because I knew he wasn't wrong. "Why are you making this a big deal?" Dan finally asked, his tone softer now, as if he was trying to diffuse the situation. "Your mom's happy. If she wasn't, she'd say something." "Would she?" Ethan countered. "Or would she just stay quiet because she's used to you not listening?" Dan opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time I saw something crack in his composure. He looked down at his beer, the flickering television light casting strange shadows across his face. Ethan didn't wait for a response. He turned sharply and headed toward the staircase. I stepped back, quickly wiping the tears from my cheeks. I didn't want him to see me like this, vulnerable and confused. But it was too late. I barely had time to retreat before he reached the top of the stairs and spotted me standing there, caught between staying and running. "Mom," he said softly, his gaze locking onto mine. I shook my head, trying to gather myself. "Ethan, you didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he replied, his voice filled with conviction. He needed to hear it. I wiped the remaining tears from my cheeks and forced a small smile. "Come on. Let's not make things harder than they need to be. Why do you always do that?" His brow furrowed, frustration bleeding into his expression. Why do you pretend like you're okay when you're not? I didn't know what to say. The truth was tangled in so many layers of habit and fear. I had gotten so used to being the glue that held things together that I forgot how to admit when I felt like I was falling apart. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against my arm. The touch was soft, comforting, and yet it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up at him, and for a moment I forgot everything. The years of marriage, the responsibilities, the boundaries I was supposed to uphold. There was only Ethan, standing there with a look in his eyes that made me feel more seen than I had in years. "You deserve more than this," he whispered, and the way he said it shattered the last bit of composure I had. I pulled back, shaking my head. "Ethan, please. This isn't." He reached for my hand, holding it gently, but firmly enough that I couldn't ignore the warmth of his skin against mine. "I'm not saying this to make things worse. I'm saying it because I see you, Mom. I see you and I care." Tears welled up in my eyes again, and this time I didn't fight them. "I know you do," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But it's complicated." His thumb brushed over my knuckles, grounding me in a way that felt both comforting and dangerous. "Then let me help you figure it out." I nodded slowly, not knowing what the future held, but unable to deny the truth of his words. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight alone. Ethan pulled me into his arms without another word. His embrace was warm, firm, and filled with something I hadn't realized I had been longing for: comfort without conditions. My cheek pressed against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to truly lean on someone. His hand gently stroked my back, and with every soft breath, I felt the weight I'd been carrying for so long begin to lift, just a little. "You don't have to do everything alone, Mom," he murmured into my hair. "Not when I'm here." I closed my eyes, savoring the warmth of his embrace, the way his words settled deep within me, soothing the ache I hadn't admitted was there. But when I pulled back, wiping my tears, I tried to smile for him, grateful but still uncertain. Ethan didn't give me a chance to overthink. "Go get dressed," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Something nice." I blinked, taken aback. "Where are we going?" He smiled, that boyish charm lighting up his face. "It's a surprise." "But, Mom," he interrupted, squeezing my hand. "Trust me." It wasn't a request. It was the kind of reassurance that left no room for argument, and for once, I didn't resist. Instead, I nodded and made my way to my room, the sound of his footsteps retreating back downstairs. I stood in front of my closet, sifting through dresses I hadn't worn in what felt like years. Some still had tags attached, pieces I bought hoping they'd make me feel like myself again but had never found the occasion to wear. My fingers brushed against a deep blue dress with a modest neckline and soft, flowing fabric. It had been sitting there for years, untouched, waiting for a moment like this. I slipped it on, the cool material hugging my skin, and when I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. For the first time in a long while I felt beautiful. I let my hair fall loosely over my shoulders, applied a touch of makeup, and slid into a pair of heels that made me feel just a little more confident. Taking one last deep breath, I walked downstairs, where Ethan was waiting by the door. The way his eyes lit up when he saw me made my heart flutter. "You look amazing," he said softly, his gaze lingering just long enough to make my cheeks flush. I laughed, brushing a hand down the front of my dress. "It's been a while since I dressed up." "Well, you should do it more often," he said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The evening air was cool, a light breeze rustling the leaves as we stepped outside. Ethan led me to his car, opening the door for me like a true gentleman. I couldn't help but chuckle at the gesture. It was the kind of thing Dan hadn't done in years, if ever. "Where are we going?" I asked again as he started the engine, but he just smiled, shaking his head. "You'll see." The drive was peaceful, the hum of the car and the glow of the streetlights creating a sense of serenity that I didn't want to break. Ethan tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to the rhythm of a song playing softly on the radio, and I found myself relaxing, the tension in my shoulders slowly melting away. We pulled up to a small, elegant restaurant tucked away on a quiet street. Twinkling lights adorned the entrance, casting a soft glow over the cobblestone path leading inside. I hadn't been to a place like this in years. Dan and I had long stopped going out to dinner unless it was for something obligatory. Ethan parked the car and hurried around to open my door, extending his hand to help me out. "After you," he said, grinning. As we stepped inside, the warmth of the restaurant enveloped me, and the scent of freshly baked bread and herbs made my mouth water. The atmosphere was cozy, with soft candlelight flickering on each table. The hostess greeted us with a smile and led us to a small table by the window. Ethan pulled out my chair, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Are you always this charming?" "Tease. Only for you," he said, winking, and my heart skipped a beat. The dinner was perfect. Simple yet special. We shared appetizers, laughed over stories from his childhood, and talked about dreams, life, and everything in between. For once, I wasn't thinking about the responsibilities waiting for me at home or the marriage that had become a distant echo of what it once was. I was simply present, enjoying the moment with my son, who made me feel like the most important person in the world. After dessert, Ethan stood and extended his hand. "Come on, let's go for a walk." I hesitated, looking down at my heels. "In these?" He grinned. "I'll catch you if you fall." We strolled down the quiet street, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the city. The night air was crisp but pleasant, and I leaned into Ethan's arm, grateful for his warmth. The streetlights cast a soft glow over the pavement, and for a moment, it felt like we were in a scene from a movie. Just the two of us, the world fading into the background. At one point, Ethan stopped in front of a small flower shop, its window filled with vibrant blooms even though the shop itself was closed. He looked around, then bent down, plucking a single daisy growing in a patch of grass nearby. With a playful flourish, he presented it to me. "Where did you get that?" I laughed, accepting the flower. "Magic," he said with a wink. "I have my ways." I shook my head, but my smile was genuine. I twirled the stem between my fingers, the simple gesture filling me with more joy than I could have imagined. We continued walking, his arm wrapped around me protectively. Occasionally he'd pull me closer, his hand resting on my waist, as if he was afraid to let go. Every time he did, my heart fluttered, and I couldn't help but wonder how this evening had become something so unexpectedly perfect. When we returned to the car, I was reluctant for the night to end. Ethan seemed to sense it too, because he reached for my hand, intertwining our fingers as we sat in comfortable silence. "You didn't have to do all this," I whispered, turning to face him. He squeezed my hand gently. "I wanted to. You deserve more than what you've been getting, Mom." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. For this moment for him. As we pulled into the driveway and he walked me to the door, I paused, looking up at him. "Thank you, Ethan. For everything." His gaze softened, and he leaned in, brushing a kiss against my forehead. "Any time," he whispered. "I'll always be here for you." And in that moment, as I stood on the threshold of my home, I realized that tonight wasn't just about the dinner, the walk, or the flowers. It was about being seen again. Truly seen by someone who cared enough to remind me of my worth. And I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to forget that.